Oh my goodness. All the energies. I'm thinking let's start. Can I move the slides? I think I got the control. Oh, yes, I can. All right, we thought it would be a good idea to start out by laying some groundwork, some foundation. I mean, I'm assuming that most of us, this is probably a primer to astrology. And for most of us, I imagine maybe a primer to depth psychology too, since we're more adolescent family play therapists here. So in addition to Santre, most people know depth psychology these days as a contemporary form of Jungian and post-Jungian forms of psychologies. So as the word psychodynamics is often used by object relationists, attachment theory people, Jungians, post-Jungians today will use the term depth psychology. And one fun thing that it's kind of like, how do you know you're a Christian? It's like, well, you believe in Christ. So what makes depth psychology depth psychology? It's often the symbol. So a study of symbols. And we make a distinction between symbol and a sign. Basically, a sign points towards something, and a symbol is the best representation of the thing in itself. So it's an image from the psyche. And a symbol relates us to the depths of our experiences because they usually carry a lot of deep emotions that will surprise the ego. And depth psychology people today will straight up use the word soul. And soul, don't think of a soul as a theological or even a philosophical thing. It's still in the realms of psychology. So think of soul as a dimension of our experience that is deep, that moves us deeply. That Thomas More, who was a friend of James Hillman, who I have listed there in the slide. James Hillman is a developer of a school of post-Jungian thought called archetypal psychology or imaginal psychology. And Thomas More, who wrote the book Care of the Soul, was his big famous book back in the 90s. Once described soul as, how did he? Oh, as both, it holds the paradox of something that's deeply mysterious and also deeply personal. So a soulful experience for you will be both kind of mysterious and enticing in that way, and also, or maybe terrifying as well. But also it feels deeply personal, more personal than personal. So moving then into, there's lots to say. There's lots of overlap between depth psychology and astrology. There's lots to say about astrology. There's lots to say about depth psychology. But I had to think back at, so what's relevant for me in my practice, especially as a psychotherapist, and for us, right, as therapists of one discipline or another. And the first thing that came to my mind was the book I had read a long time ago by a psychologist named Liz Green, who I have listed there, who's a contributor to what's known as psychological astrology. She really breaks down Jung's 4 functions. Lots of people know this these days as like from the Myers-Briggs typology indicator. Last I hear that it's still used in business, right? Yeah. So, and then of course it's like one of those fun personality tests that we can do as well. But so the zodiacs of the astrological sky is broken down to these four signs. So earth, fire, air, water, and Jung's 4 functions, Liz Green relates it to those 4 elements. So like a thinker and an air, so air sign, so Aquarian thinker, fire intuition. What I tend to think about is like if I know if a person has a lot of earth in their astrology, then I might want to appeal more to their sensing nature. So maybe dialectical behavior therapies like five senses kind of practices, or maybe more grounded kinds of things rather than necessarily analyzing dreams or finding meaning too much or something like that. That might be my initial bent. And then I would fill it out as well. And I just want to touch on Rick Tarnas real quick. I mentioned James Hillman and archetypal astrology. Rick Tarnas, it was I guess like a student of James Hillman, and he developed a pretty popular school of psychology, as far as I know, archetypal as astrology. James Hillman's son, I think, also is a contributor to it as well. And that's just kind of some convergence in the lines of development between depth psychology and astrology there. So this is from Jung. He, my analyst, my therapist let me borrow this book that not a lot of people know of, and she has all these notes in it. I'm like, oh my God, this is so cool. But Jung's Leo I had always known was, or Jung's son I had always known to be Leo, because he talks a lot about the capital S self and a lot of focus on individuation and, finding out, your deep self. His moon being in Taurus and his rising being in Aquarius doesn't surprise me. But when I found it out, and he wrote it in the book, I had this experience, like with the client, where I kind of go, oh, it makes more sense. Like it makes more sense now. Like my hunches got confirmed or something like that. And the system of astrology, as much as I know it, sort of gives me this rough map, like our psychological theories, really. And I don't know if I have it here, but one of the slides says that astrology is often considered one of the earliest personality theories. And I know that Jonathan got interested in astrology initially because of your interest in personality theories, right? So I'm gonna move. Let me see if there's something here that I wanted to. Well, the very first bullet point there I thought was a cool way of thinking about a person. And Jung, of course, is speaking here, from the early 1900s or whatever, right? So he's saying here that a person's conscious sort of personality, you can kind of see it as their sun. So oftentimes in astrology, the sun is the ego, right, Jonathan? It's considered, yeah. And the moon is a person's sort of more unconscious way of behaving. So they might moralistically relate to one thing, that could be the sun, but then behave in another way. The kind of cognitive dissonances that our clients have that we work with. Okay, and then I already touched on the middle slide there. So moving on to this is a popular term, synchronicity, in New Age kind of movements, and people kind of have a rough idea of what synchronicity is. Jung initially used it in psychotherapy in moments when a client's or a patient's sort of outlook or view sort of dramatically shifts. So it's like something close to an epiphany, but as it applies to a therapeutic moment, it's when something shifts and they soften into something, or they're able to accept something that they've resisted before, but now is that missing piece. And it happens in these moments of synchronicity that are on the level of causality. He made these like charts to explain it, and they're quite neat. But so essentially, if you measure things through causality, then it's like whatevs. But on the level of meaning to the person, it is very significant, right? And so a synchronicity essentially is a meaningful coincidence. So a moment, it could happen in the session itself, or in a dream, or a person comes in, they talk about their week or whatever, and they're like, wow, so that happened. And then they themselves, the client, relates it to something symbolic that also happens. So I have an example here. I put down, I'm going to talk about the butterfly. It's been a while, but my experience with the butterfly synchronistically This was a decade ago. I was working through something in therapy. I felt like I was in this cocoon phase. And then one day I had felt like, okay, it's time to, I was grieving something, and it was time for me to move on. I had felt ready. And the whole time, this was a whole winter season, the whole time, right by this little key lock thing by the gate where I had lived, there was this little butterfly cocoon looking thing that I thought had probably died because it was so cold. And I didn't want to touch it or remove it. I just kind of left it there. But this one fine day that I had felt great, whatever was in it had emerged and flown off. And I didn't even know it was still alive. But I told my therapist this, and that was the time he had introduced me to the term synchronicity. And what it had moved me into was relating deeply to the depths of my experience, and the kind of more spiritual side of it as well. It really opened to, there's more going on here than what my ego can track. And my ego is always expanding as I'm growing, So there's a relationship to this sort of unknown that seems to have this really beautiful intelligence of its own. And then before I had moved out of this neighborhood, I had realized that all the names in this little gated community were butterfly names. I had no clue the whole time I was living there for like 9 months. I had no idea. And yeah, so that's my little story of a synchronistic moment. And anyone here want to share a synchronistic experience?
I don't know if mine counts, but I can kind of share one. So talking about grief and butterflies, funny enough, after my grandmother died, there's like this really strong memory I have of her, where like the last time I remember seeing her really healthy, she was wearing, what grandmas wear, like that, like the moo kind of thing, like the night dress sort of stuff. And she had this really purple one on with a bunch of butterflies on it. And for some reason, that specific memory like stood out to me. I think it was like a day or after she had passed. But ever since then, I've seen butterflies literally everywhere. Like, I think for like the next 3 months, anywhere I went, there was a butterfly around. And I just attributed that to like her spirit sort of thing, like being with me. And anytime I see a butterfly now, that's her sort of thing. So I don't know if that applies, but yeah, kind of pulling from your same story of like that representation of spirit and things like that after something really significant happens. So
yeah, sounds like a synchronicity to me. I mean, synchronicity is often argued, because it's how can you prove it? Well, Jung defined it simply as it has the impact, the impact I had listed on the person, on the individual. They get the say. So that sounds like a synchronistic thing to me. The butterfly is often seen as an image of the psyche or the soul, because it's an image of transformation as well. And it's just real quick, again, we keep it in the realm of psychology, right? So it's not a thing or a theological thing, but it's an image that represents something that can relate us to the unconscious, the depths. And the butterfly is elusive and kind of close to the ground, the way the soul is, which is, depth psychologists like to distinct it from spirit, which is often represented by the bird, this kind of bird's eye view, big picture, everything sort of makes sense from up there. The soul doesn't quite make sense. The soul is more concerned with enchantment, really, than truth. And the other symbol, maybe if we have time, the crescent moon hugging the sun, maybe if we run into the halls in the office or something, you can ask me about it. It's another synchronistic thing for me. But to move on, this was Jonathan's slide, but we thought it would be a good transition for me to kind of touch on it. You all have talked about this more than I have, really, because this training came about because of I guess popular demand in some ways. Astrology is on the rise during these times. People are turning to things, I think, to give a sense of groundedness. Interestingly enough, that's how I experience astrology anyway. It's very practical. It's not necessarily so out there or concerned with my afterlife or something. It's very daily affairs. I think of it as weather. And so I think it's very relatable, the way I think psychology is relatable, because it is concerned with our everyday human affairs and relationships and all of that. Even though it kind of touches on these experiences of big picture, right? And so Jonathan, can you take it away?
Sure. Yeah, so we are seeing a rise, sort of before this, I think, was the rise in tarot, and then now we've kind of hit this next wave of the rise in astrology. From an astrological perspective, Neptune is in Pisces right now. The last time this happened in America, we had the rise of spiritualism or spiritism, where people were beginning to have seances. So we often see interest in alternative or openness in spiritual affairs during these sorts of a broader generational transit. My guess is that, and some of the feedback that I've received from Minh, is that clients will more and more be using astrological language to describe their experiences. And so if you have kind of no framing for what that means at all to them, it can be difficult to parse. And so the idea here is to give you some basic building blocks so that you can understand at least what your client is trying to communicate to you, most likely, and you can have more intelligible conversations with them about that. But of course, also, it could be something that you become interested in learning more about for yourself as well. Going to do a very, very high level, what is astrology? Very ancient. It probably started, well, it started in Babylon. They began keeping track of the movements of the planets, the wandering seven, which are stars that they realized could move. Began keeping really meticulous notes about what happened in the world during certain configurations of the planets. And then over time that moved into the Hellenistic Mediterranean area. So in Egypt really is where, so this was the period post Alexander the Great. So most of the Mediterranean spoke Greek as kind of a lingua franca. So we call it the Hellenistic period. And so in Egypt, where they had their own system of astrology that was highly based on stars, on fixed stars, that kind of merged with the Babylonian system of planetary astrology. And then we have the first, what we would think of as Western astrology or horoscopic astrology, where what you're doing is you're painting a whole map of the sky using the ascendant or the horizon line as kind of your center. It includes both planets and stars, as well as the luminaries, which are the sun and moon. And then that was developed over time. So there was a lot of interplay between the native Indian, so the Vedic or Jyotish astrology. There's a lot of shared knowledge and techniques. They're like sister traditions. And then when the Roman Empire collapsed, a lot of the knowledge from that world actually went into the Muslim world. And so during the medieval period, when Europe had the Dark Ages, quote unquote, actually science and astrology was really heavily developed in the Muslim world. So a lot of the works that we received then in Europe in the Renaissance was from the Muslim world. There was a Spanish king who actually started translating these translations of Greek works into Arabic back into Latin, and also some new works, original works in Arabic into Latin that then began to circulate in Europe again. It is not a religion, not quite a philosophy. It's often considered a science in and of its own because it describes all sorts of things. So astrology can be used as a way to describe and measure psychology, weather, politics, finance, a person's material living. So it occupies this sort of transdisciplinary place. And contemporary astrology really has two primary roots. Hellenistic, so kind of the ancient astrology, which was really rooted in Neoplatonism, as well as theosophy and depth psychology. Because there was this sort of break in the astrological tradition in the West, so in Europe, because during the Enlightenment, it fell out of favor with both the church and the academy, where previously it had been revered by both. We kind of lost a lot of the tradition. And then in the 1800s, 1900s, some people started being interested in things again like astrology, but they recast it without a lot of the pagan philosophical founding, quite literally. So they were not using that kind of philosophical founding. And so they were rooting it in psychology at that time. And so most of the astrology that people in the 60s and 70s knew was really had no reference to a lot of the ancient techniques and ancient perspectives on astrology, and was using really this quite new way of thinking about metaphysics as well as astrology itself, which was almost entirely psychologized. So some people would even say you could not predict with astrology, which of course was the primary use of astrology for thousands of years, and say no, but what you can do is say something about someone's personality. One could argue that in and of itself is a form of prediction, although some people have said what you're doing is allowing people to react and speak to the symbols like an ink blot, rather than being able to say anything objective about them. But so those are kind of the two streams that are feeding into contemporary astrology. And I would say since the 80s, we've had a lot of really important translations come through, which has revitalized the astrological world and given us back a lot of that rooting in the ancient tradition and philosophy. So what I want to do now is I'm going to very quickly go through the planets and the signs, just because I think these are the basic building blocks. You just need to know the planets and you need to know the signs. And those alone will give you most of what people are going to tell you. And then at the very end, I'm going to just briefly talk about some hot topics that people tend to talk about. If you think of hot topics in pop psychology, I'm sure you know them, things that every so often there's a think piece about it, right? That has some level of good or bad take. And then in astrology, you have the same thing. Every so often you'll have a series of articles come out about some significant event, part of astrology with a range of levels of understanding about what it actually means. But it seems likely that your clients will bring those into the consulting room. So when we're talking about the planets are really the actors. They're causing action or they're doing things. When you think about them psychologized, they are representing different facets of the psychology. So the moon, as Minh said, the moon is the subconscious and the sun is the conscious. That's a pretty good way to think of it psychologically. You can also think of the sun as sort of the brain and the moon as the gut brain. So as we know, there's just as many neurons, if not more, within the GI system. And that's actually feeding lots of information, like cognitive information, into your system. And so the moon is really representing those parts of yourself that you cannot really control those reactions, but they're happening all the time. You can affect them, but they're really influenced by things slightly out of your control. They're not conscious. And the moon is, in that sense, always been associated with the body, whereas the sun, thinking in the Hellenistic, they were very dualistic, whereas the sun was the spirit or the soul that was separate to the body, but then came together in incarnation. So the moon is representing the subconscious, emotions broadly, the act of nurturing yourself and others. So it has a lot to do with food and body. Mercury is, of course, was the messenger god. Mercury, by its orbit, never moves more than a certain number of degrees away from the sun. And so it is considered the messenger, right? So if the sun is kind of the mind, Mercury is the communication that happens from that mind. So you're looking at speaking, at skills, and at communication in general, and at thoughts. People, when we start thinking about different ways that these planets can show up in varying levels of what we call debility or dignity. So if they're treated well in the chart, or if there's some difficulties in the chart. Mercury afflictions tend to be things like nervousness, whereas moon afflictions tend to be things like not feeling cared for. Venus is going to be obviously the goddess of beauty and love. It's really it is relating in and of itself, as well as attraction. So sometimes value is put with Venus. It's really things that attract you, that you want, that you desire, things that you find aesthetically pleasing, and that can be in a very broad sense as well. She's also placed in opposition to Mars, where Mars is a separating function. Venus is a combining function, right? So she's going to try and bring people together, bring things together, whereas Mars is going to try and bring things apart. The sun is the self, mind, ego, consciousness, will, pretty straightforward. Has a large function to do with things that are seen, right? Because the sun shines light. And so parts of the chart where the sun is present or where the sun is seeing something are easily known by the individual, right? Because the sun is there. Mars is going to be desire, activity, assertion, aggression, conflict. As you can tell right off the bat, Venus and Mars can be quite gendered. And that's something that you may find so an experience that I've had in working with clients is very often women who grow up with very strong Mars have issues because they are perceived as too masculine. And similarly for men who have very strong Venus or lunar influences sometimes have some sort of a complex around that, right? That they feel like they have not been able to be themselves because of X, Y, Z, because of the way that they're socialized by gender. So you can see some interesting dynamics within sort of how someone's own psychological makeup or personality typology, as described by the astrology, interacts with the environment which they've grown up. And that can also be as specific as their own family environment, right? And then what you're looking at is you're looking at interactions between their chart and their family's charts. Jupiter is faith, growth, optimism, spirituality. When you're thinking psychologically, this is very often whether someone tends to have hope about things or does not tend to have hope about things. Afflicted Jupiters tend to be just a bit more cynical, right? And sometimes quite extremely more cynical. And that, of course, impacts the way that they lead their lives. It doesn't mean that they don't have hope, but they tend to be much more grounded in the things that can go wrong than someone who has a very strong Jupiter that may be incredibly happy to take tons of risks because they just have trust in life, right? Or they have a spiritual outlook that provides them with a great deal of emotional security when risks or when difficulties come through. So that's the Jupiter function. With Saturn, you have Saturn. So Saturn is the last of the visible planets, the traditional 7. So Saturn always represented limits, the hard limits of reality. So we think of Saturn as the great demarcator of what is part of our visible world, and then the trans-Saturnian planets, which are usually, Uranus is an exception, invisible to the naked eye, that are more generational and more sort of transpersonal. And then all of the planets from Saturn to the moon are quite personalized and quite rooted in reality and lived reality. So Saturn is restriction, maturity, discipline, death. One of the easiest ways to think about Saturn is that Saturn's cycle is about 28 to 30 years. And what happens when people turn 30, they go through this really significant maturation cycle. And that's when Saturn has completed a circuit around their chart and returned to its natal placement. So we call that the Saturn return. That is something you will likely hear people talk about in pop astrology. So that's that moment when, and it happens again right around the age 60, when you're having kind of a real reckoning with your own structures in life, your own maturation in life. And we do see, right, significant differences between people pre and post that cycle. Uranus is disruption, individualism, innovation. Rick Tarnas refers to Uranus as Prometheus, which is the Titan who stole fire from the gods to give to humans. There's this really disruptive and progressive part of Uranus, but it can also be like destructive in the sense that he brings sudden change and quite strong changes. Neptune is dissolution, merging, fantasy, transcendence. So within Neptune, you kind of have this whole range of everything from drug addiction all the way to spiritual experiences and things in between. Neptune also, when you're looking at mundane astrology, so the study of politics, Neptune tends to be things like communism that bring groups of people together into idealism, and Uranus tends to be things that are more individualized. So sometimes that can be anarchy, or sometimes it can be more capitalist models where the individual is king. Pluto is transformation, power, intensity, upheaval. Pluto returns in national charts are one of the best ways to look at their lifespan. The Pluto cycle is about 244 years. We're going through now a Pluto opposition of the US. So this is like one of the first reckonings in US power structures, or the Pluto return, sorry. And so that's, I think we can all feel that what's happening in the US is that power structures and the way that power is organized is being challenged and reorganized in a pretty severe way. And that's similar in a personal chart as well. Strong Pluto contacts are going to be about power struggles and really digging into the depths of someone's unconscious and digging up those things that need to be transformed. Are there any questions on the planets? I'm going to jump into the signs next, but I know I threw a lot of information at you. Are there any planets, any questions about how they work or individual planets or anything like that? Okay. So for the signs, if you think of the planets as the actors in a play, the signs are like the costumes they wear. So some costumes fit the planets better than others, right? So we think of, that's why we can say that some planets are stronger or weaker in certain signs. It's because the costume maybe doesn't really fit their role. And so they're having to act a little bit differently or look a little bit funny doing what they want to do. So for instance, Aries goes to Mars. Aries is competition, enthusiasm, initiation, all things that are very consonant with the significations and the function of Mars. Taurus is pleasure, beauty, stability. This goes to Venus. Gemini is curiosity, connection, communication. This goes to Mercury. Cancer is nurture, cycle, security. This goes to the Moon. Leo is confidence, generosity, insight. This goes to the Sun. And Virgo is expertise, analysis, service. This goes to Mercury as well. So I hope that you can already kind of see how some of these significations easily match up with the planets. Whereas, for instance, if you had Mars and Taurus, that's a weak placement for Mars, because Mars is trying to do things like assert itself and be strong and cause disruption in a place where everything around it just wants to be stable and beautiful and full of pleasure and not causing disruption, right? And so we say that that's a difficult placement for Mars. Not that you can't be functional, and actually you see many highly successful people have what we call debilitated planets. From a lived experience, what that often means is they had to work really hard to master that function. And through that work, they achieved mastery, right? Or found some unique way to solve the problem and therefore achieve their goals. Libra, this goes to Venus as well, goes to balance, relationship, and aesthetic. Scorpio is intimacy, depth, and drive. This goes to Mars. Sagittarius is growth, exploration, and belief. This is Jupiter. Capricorn is achievement, responsibility, and longevity. This goes to Saturn. Aquarius is knowledge, detachment, and structure. This goes to Saturn as well. And then Pisces is compassion, imagination, and adaptation. And this goes to Jupiter. So you can see that when you go from Aries to Pisces, you're also completing a journey of sorts. Aries is the spring point, right? So you go from spring all the way to spring again at the end of Pisces. Through that, you go through from Aries, the self, to Taurus, what is around me, what do I like, what's bringing me pleasure, to Gemini, how do I interact with my surroundings, to Cancer, what is my home, what's my nurturing, what's my private life, to the Sun, who am I, what's my creative impulse, to Virgo, how do I accomplish things in a day-to-day life, how do I take care of myself, how do I get good at my work, to Libra, how do I interact with the other, what's partnership mean to me, to Scorpio, what is power in partnership, how do I negotiate being myself but being in relationship. Then you have Sagittarius, what are those lessons I've learned, how do I use them to shape my life purpose, right? How do I draw meaning out of life? Then Capricorn, I have the meaning, how do I create the structure, how do I achieve, how do I accomplish? Then you have Aquarius, I've accomplished things, feel like things could be better. Now that I have this broader perspective on life, I have ideas about how to improve things on a broader scale for people outside of myself, for society. Then you have Pisces, which is recognizing the limits of what you personally can do and really understanding the connectedness of everyone and everything. And then you have the metaphorical death again and rebirth in the Aries process. So you can see it's a closed cycle that kind of tries to cover the entire realm of a life cycle, both personal and you can generalize that out really to any level. Any questions on the signs? Okay. So last I'm going to talk about just a couple kind of keywords that you'll hear. So the ascendant or rising sign. So we've talked about the sun and moon, the sun being kind of the ego or the conscious self, the moon being kind of the subconscious self or the feeling body. The ascendant is the other most important part. Traditionally, it was actually the most important part. The sun changes sign once a month. Although it moves a degree a day. The moon changes sign about every 2 days. The ascendant sign changes about every 2 hours. So this is a highly individual part of the chart because this is the literal horizon line at any moment. And if you think of the sun as the conscious self, the moon as the subconscious self, the ascendant is sort of you'll often hear it described as a mask. I think that's not a good way to think about it. It's actually the social role that you've been trained or learned to play. And this becomes really the way that a person navigates life. So this is who they think they should be and who they are then, right? And so it's how they're constantly acting to navigate through life. The Greeks called it the helmsman of the ship. And so you get really interesting insights into someone's psyche if the sun and the rising sign and the moon are not harmonious, right? If they are harmonious together, then you have someone who quite easily navigates through life in a way that they want. Whereas if you have these disharmonious relationships between any of them, then you may have issues in 2 different ways, or their inner person doesn't represent who they're presenting to the world, right? Bringing it back to psychology, the ascendant is the self, and then what gets projected, the opposite house, which is the 7th house of other. And so often when I'm working in consults with clients, I look at that 7th house and see how much have they integrated that into their personality or how much are they seeking it in other people. And that can be a really interesting and helpful, fruitful conversation that they can have. Any questions about the rising sign or ascendant? Okay. Mercury retrograde. I'm sure we've all heard of it. So a retrograde planet is when, because of the orbits overlapping in a certain way, a planet appears to go backwards from the Earth's perspective. No planets ever go backwards, but because of physics, right? Sometimes it looks like that. Mercury goes retrograde very often because of its proximity to the sun. And so the nature of its orbit makes it look like from the Earth's perspective, it's going retrograde usually 3 times a year. Retrogradation traditionally in astrology means that you have to do something again, or that a planet is weakened in its ability to move forward. What we find is that usually it means you're returning, reviewing, redoing, retrospecting. You're doing rewords because literally what it looks like is the planet goes over a set of degrees and then stops and goes back over those degrees and then stops and then goes back over those degrees a third time. And so you get what we call a shadow period, a retrograde period, and then a final direct period. So those points of someone's chart get hit 3 times by that planet. So there's usually some big emphasis. Currently, for instance, we're going through a Venus retrograde in Capricorn that will last until mid-January, or the end of January, actually, I think the 28th. And so these are always significant. The reason why Mercury retrograde tends to be viewed quite difficultly is because we rely on Mercury functions. So Mercury is writing and communication and planning and travel and signing contracts and all these things. And so it always feels like it's having a really big impact. That being said, traditionally speaking, Mercury retrogrades will only have major impacts on people for whom Mercury is an important planet natally, meaning it's their ruler or is tightly wound up with their sun or moon, and or if Mercury is activated by a timing technique. So from a traditional kind of, from an astrological technique perspective, we don't anticipate that everyone is having a bad Mercury retrograde all the time, every year. It should be some people are having a pretty rough Mercury retrograde because Mercury is important for them for some reason. And then that should wax and wane over time as Mercury becomes more or less important according to timing techniques. However, this is well in the pop astrology world now, and so people will talk about it a lot, I'm sure. The lunar cycle. Lunar cycles are actually not huge in astrology. They're important just in the sense that they are movements of the planets, but in sort of New Age thought, lunar cycles became really centralized in sort of the thinking of how you navigate life. So you will probably hear people talk about these sorts of things. New moons typically indicating the start of a new cycle, full moons indicating a climax or success. Waning periods are for pruning, waxing periods are for growing. These are all true in terms of traditional, like basic principles astrologically as well. And there are some timing techniques that do use these cycles. But yeah, so I think you'll hear people talk about them in these ways. And this is kind of how you can probably relate to what they're saying. Full moons are also, they're a tense aspect. So the opposition is a tense aspect. And so astrologically, they're considered to be actually an unstable energy. And you wouldn't often elect to do something on a full moon. You would elect to do something right before the full moon, and when it's a more stable aspect, but it's very full and light. So yeah, lunar cycles. Eclipses. Eclipses are quite a big deal in astrology. They have also entered into pop astrology. They have traditionally been viewed as a very unstable or momentous moment. Eclipses happen every year. They happen along what are called the lunar nodes, which is just basically the path that the moon and the sun have eclipses along. And that moves through the zodiac about every 18 months. So we're actually just ending a Sagittarius Gemini cycle, and we're about to begin a Taurus Scorpio cycle for the next year and a half. Eclipses, when they are very closely connected to a person's chart, are momentous in the sense that they do tend to bring changes, sometimes pretty big changes. They are more important in mundane astrology when you're thinking about politics. I think you will hear people talk about them. This is probably what they're meaning. Something big is changing. They're going through a really difficult period. They're in a crisis. People often think about eclipses as bringing about crisis. So I think those might be things that you would hear and maybe you can understand when people are talking about eclipses. Any questions on any of those kind of hot topics? Okay. And that is actually the end of our little presentation. So I think we were hoping to do questions and sort of open discussion now, right, Minh?
Yeah. That was awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. What an honor to open for you.
Thank you. That was okay. I'm fascinated by this stuff. Honestly, I really, okay. So here are my takeaways. So the analogy of the butterfly, I think that one's really, really powerful. I use that a lot with kids, just in talking about how, we think that butterflies are these beautiful things that they make a cocoon and then boom, they're good, right? But helping to explain to them that no, it's actually like super messy inside there. Like they have to decompose and be a pile of goo before they can actually turn into something beautiful. So that's something that I've used before. And you're right, the Mercury in retrograde, oh my gosh, I hear that so much. And it is a very trendy pop, something's wrong, Mercury must be in retrograde. Without knowing as much about astrology as the two of you do, how do you think that, like, what would be a good basic way to kind of integrate this into some of our sessions? I guess in terms of when you were talking, I was kind of thinking, I was actually thinking about our shared family and how they are very keyed into roles in Disney movies is what they use. And how that might shift to kind of give them roles, in a sense of where are they astrologically instead. So I don't really know what my question is, but where would be, like, where could, I don't know, Minh, if you use, so Minh and I have a family where I've seen one or a couple of them for years, and then Minh kind of inherited like all the other kids. So we do some joint family sessions sometimes to kind of tie them together, but they're very, very, I would say this family is very set in what their roles are, and they've defined roles for everybody in the family. And it's, so they butt heads a lot when they.
I can speak to maybe part of that, and then Minh, maybe you can talk to something more rooted in the therapeutic context. But something that, so for instance, in my own practice, what you'll find is that some people hyper-identify with one part of their chart, right? And some of that is normal as we develop and as different parts of ourselves are important at different periods of our times. And sometimes that corresponds really tightly to some timing system that's being activated. But especially around like that first and seventh house axis, I often find that's a helpful conversation, right? If they're like hyper identified with their rising sign planet or their rising sign period, being like, okay, you're a Libra rising. What about the Aries stuff in your life? Are you just continually finding people to boss you around, or are you taking some of that into your own life, right? Or a lot of people are hyper identified with their sun sign because that's what they know, right? And then to be able to say, no, look, like you have all the signs in your chart. Let's look at where the other things are. And then maybe you can have a discussion, right? Where they can start to research that, and maybe that helps them to understand different parts of themselves. I think that's where most people get into astrology and stick with it, is because it is a very comprehensive personality structure. And it does allow people to have a lot of hooks, right, onto things that they can relate to and that I would argue are like objectively true about them as like a predisposition or a temperament. And so that can be something to say, like, you've really been focused on what Saturn is doing in your chart in our sessions. Have you looked at Jupiter? Maybe you could look at that for the next couple of sessions and come back and tell me what you find. Something like that might be helpful. Similarly in family systems, sorry.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, thanks.
Building off of that, and I was actually thinking along the same lines, Jonathan, is I think people tend to over-identify with usually like their sun sign or something. And sometimes I think getting to know, even getting to know another person's sign can help facilitate like more understanding. Oh, okay, well, of course you're this way. It's because, so it's not necessarily like a blame thing as much as a kind of a relating or like a we all have our dispositions. And then I think the idea of the zodiac, it's kind of all in us. And even though we over-identify with one thing, it's all kind of in us. So it can help facilitate some connection with self, but also compassion thereby, because it's kind of all in us and it's all in everyone else as well. And that's the archetypal level that I think, it's the universal level, right? Which is, when people get polarized in relationships, they're taking on two aspects of a drama. And I think theoretically, if it's both in you and both people can connect it, then I think it depolarizes the tension a little bit. And it seems to facilitate more, again, understanding and then maybe empathy and connection. That's where my mind jumps to with some of this. And the synchronicity sign, I forgot that Jung understood astrology in a synchronicity fashion, as in they're meaningful coincidences. So the way that the stars move and the way we experience our lives, our daily lives, our consciousness are meaningfully linked. So you can't really argue it on a causal level, but on a meaningful level, you can. And there's also connection to the archetypes as well, because the planets have, and Jonathan touched on this, these sort of archetypal energy cores that are activated in all of us and are emphasized in each person's chart, right? Let's say their natal chart or something, there are emphases of these energies, but they're also kind of all in us. Again, at the same time, we just relate more one to the other. Yeah, my mind goes to that.
No, that's really cool. And that's helpful. And that does make sense. Yeah, I don't think I even understood that I was anything more than a Taurus. I mean, I'm stubborn, but I care, and that's what I go with. But I'm also surprised nobody else is a Taurus. I'm the only one in our group. Wow, analyze that, y'all.
My parents were Taurans. My parents are Taurus.
Okay.
My therapist is a Taurus, so it makes sense.
Okay.
My boss is also a Taurus.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I feel a little better. Okay.
Help ground me. Well, that's the relationship part, is I'm airy, and I need people in my life who can ground me. So
yeah, and I need people in my life that call me out. They're like, no. No. Okay, awesome. Does anybody else have any questions or observations?
I have a quick question. So I feel like this resonated quite a bit. Like, I was hearing you say like the different, I guess, like motives or the different things that are guided by the signs. Stop. And it's funny because my sun sign is Scorpio. Stop it. I swear she's quiet the entire time, and now I'm talking, so she has to yell over me because she's my kid. Yeah. So, but it was really funny because like the theme of my couples therapy is like how to be independent, but also be in a partnership with somebody. And I was like, I'm a Scorpio, so that really resonated. And then the whole 30-year thing, like I became a mother at 30. So I really feel like I transitioned into a different part of life. But I'm confused about how to know, like it sounds like mainstream wise, people identify with their sun sign. But I also heard that what's more important almost is their rising sign, which I think most people probably don't even know without doing one of these charts, which means you have to know what time you were born. But all that aside, let's say you figure it out. How do you know if they conflict with one another? Like I'm a Gemini rising. Like I have, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. Does it conflict with my sun sign Scorpio? Are they in harmony? What does it mean to be in harmony?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously a super complicated question, but here's the broad strokes. And I think what most people will bring into the consulting room as well, which is the elements are harmonious or disharmonious with each other. So air and fire are harmonious with each other. Gemini being air gets along with fire signs and air signs. So Libra, Gemini, Aquarius, or Aries, Sagittarius, Leo. Those are all like good harmonious aspects. The earth and water signs get along together. So Scorpio being a water sign would get along with Cancer, Pisces, as well as Taurus, Capricorn, Virgo. So that's one way in which the harmoniousness is determined. The other is what is the relationship to season. So if they're a season start sign, so that's going to be Aries for spring, Cancer for summer, Libra for autumn, Capricorn for winter. Those are going to be, they see each other and there's like a tension, but they see each other, right? So there's like, we're all starters. That's that energy. Then you have the middle of the season, which is going to be Taurus for spring, Leo for summer, Scorpio for autumn, and Aquarius for winter. Again, they all see each other and they're like, wow, we're really fixed and stubborn, but we get each other in some sense, but we all do it in our own elemental way, which is where that tension comes from, right? And then you have the season end, which is going to be Gemini for spring, Virgo for summer, Sagittarius for autumn, and Pisces for winter. And so it's the same thing. They're changeable, they're mutable. So they all see each other, but they all do that changeable thing in a different way because they do it by their elemental quality, right? As well as the individual sign quality. So those are the main things you're going to see. You're going to see people mostly talk about elements and do the elements get along? And then if they know a little bit more, they might talk about the modality. Are they cardinal, fixed, or mutable? And how does that? So you might hear people say like, I'm all mutable. I can't stand my mother who's super fixed, like she doesn't get me. I want to do 500 things and she's so stubborn and fixed in her ways, right? Like this is a very typical thing you'll hear someone say, right? In like a pop kind of astrology way. So I think those are the main things. But when you're thinking about, are they harmonious, disharmonious, you're really thinking about elemental dignity and agreement. And those correspond roughly to introversion or yin, sometimes it's called in pop astrology, which would be earth and water, and extroversion or yang, which would be air and fire. And you'll also hear them described as masculine and feminine as well.
It kind of makes me think of, I know these aren't the same, but kind of the same way that we work with the love languages, how it doesn't really matter if, your top love language is this and your top love language is this. It doesn't mean, oh, you guys are doomed to failure. It just means that, okay, well, let's understand it and let's see where each other are coming from and how that kind of, I don't know, forms like who you are and how you relate to things. Not that it's okay, well, that's it. Like, we're not compatible. It's more just an understanding. Okay.
Yeah. And I think,
okay.
No, sorry, go ahead. Yes, I think you'll hear a lot about compatibility, right? Because one way, so if people aren't trying to learn about themselves, they're trying to learn about a relationship, right? Those tend to be the two ways that people are getting into astrology. And so you will hear compatibility come up a lot. And there's lots of online tests for compatibility of greater or less complexity. I think the richer discussion is, first of all, looking at the whole chart, right? Because like, for instance, Jen, you said, well, there's no other Taurus, but there's probably other Taurus placements, right, in this group. And so there's overlaps that way that are going to be really resonant. And then even if there aren't, there's like a lot of water and earth in this room already. I called out at the beginning. So already you have all this like elemental harmony going on. And so when you're talking about people saying like, oh, I'm a Scorpio, like for instance, Danielle, if someone was a Gemini sun and they were dating a Scorpio sun and they're like, we have nothing in common. It's like, well, what do you have in common? Scorpios are really interested in investigating and learning and going deep into a topic. Gemini loves to talk and discuss and learn about things, right? Already there's something there you can talk about, and that's probably something that bonds you. And so, like you said, Jen, it's not like you can't get along. It's like there are going to be difficulties like there are in any relationship. What are the things that we can identify that are similar versus the things that, yeah, you're going to have to deal with, right? Because you're different people.
A lot of it sounds like it's making the unconscious conscious. So how it applies to therapy is that astrology offers a little bit of a peek into the unconscious.
Okay. Cool.
Other questions?
I have a question. As therapists, are there any specific dates this year that we need to be aware of in astrology that are either very positive or something that we just need to be cognizant about?
There's a Mercury retro coming up, right?
Yes. It might be helpful to just present like a list. So I can probably give like a list of the major transits for this year. Yeah, there's a lot. There's obviously a lot happening in the last couple of years, and there have been in the sky as well. So we'll bring you, I can send a list to Minh, and then we can give you just some really big items, like nothing too specific. But for instance, like the retrogrades, Jupiter changes signs. There's some things like that that might be useful.
Thank you, that'd be wonderful.
That would be really cool. Just knowing that Pluto's in opposition to the US right now, I was like, oh, okay. Well, obviously. I'm kidding. I was 2 years old when I learned about any of this, so cool. Okay, anything else? No? Okay. Well, I just want to thank both Minh and Jonathan for presenting. This was really cool. I can see how I can use a lot of this actually in our session. So I hope you all can too. I think it would be super fun for us. Yay, Amelia loves it too. Yay, Amelia. We'll talk about this. I've been talking about this for a year, putting together kind of our about us things for staff. Maybe we should put our signs on there. I think that would be something fun too, that we could start, incorporating and learning a little bit more about. So, okay. Well, thank you again to both of you. Did you stop recording? Someone else stopped recording.
Jen, you're recording, right?
Yeah, but it's not recording anymore.
Really?
It says it's recording.
Oh, it says it is. Okay, never mind. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording. Sorry, so that you both can use this.